Now that I posted about raw milk, I have some of the most lobotomized individuals in my comments, people I would have never even known existed. It's mostly right-wing types who think everything is a conspiracy theory, which reminded me of this New York Times article talking about how the crunchy movement is now right-wing, which really is crazy because crunchy culture used to be so hippie-ish and left-wing.
Okay, as an old hippie permaculture mom who really exemplified what crunchy meant 15, 20 years ago, and who no longer uses that label at all, specifically because of the crunchy to alt-right RFK Maha pipeline. In fact, I have a whole video on my YouTube about Maha. You should go watch it. Okay, no hate to this creator whatsoever. I enjoyed her video. However, I think younger folks might not understand that the crunchy mom sphere has been right-leaning for a really long time, has been radicalizing people for the right for a really long time. This is not a new phenomenon, and I think a lot of people who enter into crunchy spaces and are interested in things like, ecological breastfeeding, cloth diapering, co-sleeping, eating local, organic, nutritious food, eating seasonally, wearing natural fiber clothing, having healthy communication with your children, being empathetic, learning nonviolent communication, trying to reduce your use of plastics, reduce your carbon footprint, live more sustainably, to have a holistic view of our body, our relationship to other people and to the planet. All of that is well and good, but those spaces have been radicalizing people for the alt-right for more than 20 years. Obviously, as a permaculture person, my crunchy cred is pretty strong. But, I had a water birth for one of my kids. I spent 12 years of my life breastfeeding. I co-slept with all my kids. I used cloth diapers. I was legit walk the walk. Until I started to see things in my community that were really concerning to me. And I started to remove myself from crunchy spaces. Let me explain my community and my experience a little bit better. So I was in a group called Too Crunchy for Portland Moms. You know that if you are too crunchy to fit in with the moms group for Portland, Oregon, where we're breastfeeding, we're putting our kids in cloth diapers, we are naming our children nori, we're feeding them nori, they're wearing hemp clothes, Bobucks and Star Child shoes. Everybody's got their baby in a sling or an ergo. We're all using Dr. Bronner's, right? This is the group that we are too crunchy for, so we formed our own group. Right, for me personally, it was the shit-talking people who are still breastfeeding their toddlers that caused me to leave the Portland Moms group and move to the Too Crunchy group. I did not realize at that time, and it took me a while to see it come to the forefront, how much that group and other spaces like that, play groups that I was a part of at that time, were spaces that radicalized people for the alt-right, were spaces that really perpetuated a lot of conspiracy theory, anti-science nonsense. There were three main things that caused me to leave that group a number of years ago, where I felt like a lot of my interaction was pissing off other moms because I was pushing back against a lot of woo and trying to offer, pro-science, evidence-based practice perspective in these conversations. And the three things that caused me to ultimately leave the group were there were moms who refused to treat their kids with antibiotics for impetigo and who seemed to believe that all antibiotics altogether were bad. The proliferation of anti-vax rhetoric that just got more and more conspiracy theory, anti-science, and extreme over time. Right, like a mom posting about how her kid cut their foot badly on a piece of glass in the garden. She was in the ER with her kid getting stitches and was fearful because they were pushing a tetanus vaccine on her unvaccinated child. And I was like, of course you fucking get a tetanus vaccine for your kid because tetanus lives in the soil. There is no reason to not get a tetanus vaccine. But all of the other moms were like, oh my gosh, you got to stand up for your rights, mama. Don't let them put that poison in your baby. Right, so my brain was exploding at this point. And then the third thing that really tipped me over the edge was the raw milk rhetoric, y'all. This was 15 years ago. Right, I am the granddaughter, the daughter, the sister of physicians. And so for me, I have never been into the kind of anti-science, fearful of Western medicine woo that a lot of crunchy moms are really entrenched in. And I understand why people have a lot of medical trauma and would have real significant complaints about our medical system and about Western medicine. And there's a significant amount of scientific illiteracy and a lot of anti-science propaganda and a lot of woo in these groups. And I understand, I've never been very woo-tastic as a person at all, but I understand folks who want to look for alternative healing methods. But the fear of science and the wanting to pull away and not educate yourself about basic scientific realities was kind of a hallmark of these crunchy mom spaces I was in. And I noticed that there was a significant amount of overlap in that, like, fear of science, scientific illiteracy, and having almost like a religious belief in anti-science practices. There was a significant overlap there with my evangelical friends, right? Even 20 years ago when we lived on the Central Oregon coast, the conservative religious community that, the homeschool group that I was a part of there, these moms were all deeply far-right religious, but they also were incredibly crunchy. And they were also afraid to teach their children science. They were often using, like a Becca or other evangelical homeschool curricula that ensured their children would be scientifically illiterate, and that would talk about things like species are not mutable, right? Because they're as God created them. I mean, it was just, again, my head was exploding a lot on and off for like a 20-year period of my life while I was involved in these kind of, evangelical and crunchy overlap circles. I don't mean this to be rude, but when you have a community that is uneducated, that is scientifically illiterate, after all, the Cheeto said he loves the uneducated, they're his favorite. You have people who are more susceptible to propaganda. In my community on the Central Oregon coast, folks were into IBLP. They were having wisdom booklets, that's what the Duggars used, as the educational materials for their kids. At the same time, selling doTERRA and believing in essential oils over antibiotics. Folks who are raised to be fearful of the world, to view their faith and science as diametrically opposed, and that science is a risk to their faith. Those folks were also into, home birth, extended breastfeeding, but they weren't raising their children with nonviolent communication. They were using plumbing line, breaking their children's will, emphasizing first-time obedience, teaching kids from a young age to unquestioningly submit to authority. Don't trust your own intuition. Don't trust your own instinct. Don't question at all. Blindly follow authority. You can see how this combination leads very quickly to radicalization for the alt-right. It also gets people to be deeply uncritical of conspiracy theories. If someone says that they are an expert in something, if someone presents themselves as authoritative, these crunchy kids raised by crunchy moms who've been denied access to scientific education or much of an education in general, they are susceptible to indoctrination. They are susceptible to conspiracy theories. And they're already primed by being into these crunchy gardening, canning, breastfeeding, cloth diapering, doing things old-timey and homesteady. I mean, there's so many other layers to this, but these groups were so easily conflated. Deeply religious, crunchy, alt-right, very, very easy to see how all of this became one kind of, tornado. There are so many other layers to this, but I do want to make it really clear that the crunchy to alt-right pipeline is not new. It's at least 20 years in the making. Those left-wing hippies reading Mother Earth News, they were not alone. There were also the conservative evangelical moms reading Backwoods Home magazine. And all of the virtue signaling and symbolism that you wanted to use to declare yourself part of the crunchy movement, to be in the world but not of it. Much like speaking Christianese and having all of these ways of phrasing things and symbols that you use so that you know that you're both part of the in-group, crunchy moms were the same way. There were all of these ways that you would signal to other people that you were legit in the community. And drinking raw milk was one of those, right? You didn't have a carton of milk in the fridge. You had this like very large, old pickle jar basically that you would have full of raw milk that you got from your local farmer. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big locavore. But I also have a biology degree and I understand why we pasteurize milk. I remember being horrified after the fact to find out that my eldest daughter, who was about 3 at the time, was fed raw milk when we were over at the house of, very crunchy, hippie, conservative Christian homeschooling family with 10 kids. Milk from a farm that later had an E. coli outbreak that damaged the kidneys of a 2-year-old child. Luckily, my kid was okay and the other kids at the play date were okay. But that kid is now 22. This stuff is not new. It's not new. And I think for those of us on the left, even those of us who are now on the left who used to be on the right or libertarian, we've got to get a lot more clued into the fact that the right was laying these foundations, creating these pipelines in so many communities across America. Ages ago, decades ago. This is not new. They were playing the long game and we weren't. The shift to the far right in America has been a long time coming. These are the dividends on investments these folks made 20, 30 years ago.